Hi, I'm Pastor Brian Schwertley of Reformation Fellowship, Reformed Presbyterian Church.
Hi, and I'm Pastor Stephen Pribble, pastor of Grace Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Welcome to Reformation Forum, the program relating the unchanging truth of Scripture to current issues.
Tonight's subject is the Industrial Revolution. You know, Stephen, this is a Christian show with a very distinctive Christian perspective. Why is it important that Christians understand the Industrial Revolution?
Well, I'm sure some of our viewers are wondering that when they heard the title, The Industrial Revolution. What are we doing on a Bible talk show talking about the Industrial Revolution? Well, it was actually the Lord Jesus Christ who gave us His law. It's called the Law of Christ, and in the book of Exodus, the 8th commandment is, "Thou shalt not steal." And a lot of people have never even thought of the fact that this has ramifications not only for the individual, but also to governments. And tonight it is our privilege to have as our special guest George Leith. George is president of Patrick Henry Associates of East Lansing, Michigan. This is a business devoted to selling good ideas. He's a native of Wisconsin. He has an economics degree from Carroll College and a law degree from Duke University. For some time, he was professor of law and economics at Northwood University and also a legislative aide to Dave Honigman until just recently. And for most of his life, George has been a student of the philosophy, economics, and history of liberty. And he's done that for over 25 years. George, it is really a privilege to have you here.
Glad to be here, Steve.
And George, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution. A lot of times people that are advocates of big government use the Industrial Revolution as the model for government intervening in the economy and saving the common man.
Yes.
And during the Industrial Revolution, weren't living conditions really terrible for the common man?
The Industrial Revolution, most people are absolutely unaware, did more to improve living conditions than centuries of economic development. Really, there wasn't much economic development prior to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which was about 1750. The Industrial Revolution was really a revolution, not in the usual sense of blood and fighting, but as a revolution in the way things were produced. A change from producing things by hand, by muscle power in small shops or in the home, to mass production in factories. The best case, of course, being the textile industry, the textile mills, the so-called dark satanic mills that were demonized by many writers, were the first factories, the first instance of mass production. Later on in time, other things came to be mass produced. And with mass production came falling prices for things, much greater availability for goods, and higher wages for workers. If we looked at conditions today, we'd say they were terrible. But compared to the way they had been previously in time, actually the living conditions improved dramatically during the Industrial Revolution. There is a myth that was propounded by many of the opponents, who usually had their own axe to grind, that there was some golden age prior to the Industrial Revolution where things were wonderful and people were well-fed and happy. It is false. We know because the English are very good record keepers. They kept good records on many things, including, for instance, infant mortality. The rate of infant mortality prior to the Industrial Revolution was over 75%. Diet for the people was terrible. People subsisted on porridge, a little bit of cheese. Beer was commonly drunk because there wasn't much in the way of fresh water that you could drink. Life expectancy was short. Disease was rampant because they had no sanitary conditions. The streets were the sewers. People wore the same filthy clothing for decades because that's all they could afford. Woolen clothing that could hardly be washed, otherwise it would fall apart. They would wear this until it almost literally fell apart. That's how poor the people were, the common people. Of course, there was an aristocracy. But the common people lived miserable lives of hard drudgery, working from sunup to sundown 6 days a week, and that had relatively been unchanged for centuries. The Industrial Revolution changed things dramatically and for the better.
But weren't the workers like, you know, we always hear about how the workers were abused and they were forced to work basically from sun up to sundown in these horrid conditions. What about that, that kind of idea that we hear in the public schools and everything?
Well, there was probably no more abuse of workers during the Industrial Revolution than there had been previously. However, there was much more competition for labor, and pretty quickly the businessmen found that if they treated their workers well, they could get a better quality worker and retain workers. One of the most successful of the industrialists was Robert Owen, who ran a company called Lanark Mills. He made a point of paying his workers a little bit better, giving them the best conditions he could under the circumstances, and treating them with kindness. It wasn't surprising that his mills turned out the best quality cloth, which he could sell for a premium. And pretty soon other mill owners realized if we treat people badly, we'll lose them to Owen, who was expanding because his business was so successful. Did the people work long hours? They did. But that was by choice. They could earn more money by working longer hours, and when people were as poor, as desperately poor as the people were back in that period of time, more money was more important to them than leisure time. It meant more to them to be able to earn money for food and heat and clothing than to sit around and be cold. So again, comparing it with circumstances today, it seems terrible. But given their options, working long hours made more sense to them than working lesser hours.
And they could have quit any time they wanted.
Well, they could have, and some factory owners, under pressure from reformers, began to reduce the hours in the 1820s, 1830s. And what they found is that quite a few workers quit to go elsewhere where they could earn more money.
Which meant working longer hours.
Which meant working longer hours. Which meant working longer hours. Now, it's oftentimes argued, well, shouldn't the government have stepped in and done something to force hours down? But that simply would have taken the option away from people of working more and earning more. And I think one of the most important conclusions we can draw from this episode or almost anything else in economics is you never make people better off by restricting their options. But that's exactly what happens when the government comes in, as eventually it did, and says you cannot work more than such a length hour day.
All right. Well, George, shouldn't government have compelled business owners to improve pay and working conditions, or else maybe tax their profits for projects to benefit the public interest?
Well, that's a line you will hear from many people today, that should be done today, that it should have been done then. But the trouble with that argument, besides the fact that it entails coercion, which I think is fundamentally wrong, is that it would have slowed down the rate of growth of the economy. We could have taxed profits away from these industrialists, but those profits were used to expand their businesses, to buy more factories, to buy more power looms, to hire more workers. If we had done what many people think is the right thing to do and taxed them or forced them to pay higher wages, it would have meant a slower rate of economic growth. It would have meant people would have waited longer for the benefits that industrialization was bringing to them. Consider, for example, their garments. I mentioned that people prior to the Industrial Revolution pretty much wore filthy wool garments. They got filthy after time because you could really not wash wool very well. It was warm in England, that's important, but people were too poor to buy anything else. The main product of the early Industrial Revolution was cotton garments that could be laundered and were much cheaper to buy than wool. This was a tremendous benefit to people. For the first time, they could really enjoy wearing something that was comfortable and hygienic, that could be laundered. If we had taxed away the profits to a greater or lesser extent, we would have slowed down the beneficial growth of production of cotton garments and many other things, soap, iron pipe that could eventually be used for water and sewer systems. All of that would have been slowed down if the government had stepped in and said, we're going to tax profits away. It would have diverted resources away from their most important economic uses at the time.
Well, this is surely a different view of economics than you commonly hear nowadays.
Absolutely. Well, weren't child labor laws well-intentioned and beneficial to children?
Another great myth. They were probably well-intentioned. Many of the reformers looked at children working long hours in textile mills or other employments, and they said, this is terrible. Children shouldn't work here. Now, there had always been child labor in England. going back before time out of mind. Children had worked. They couldn't afford not to work, except for the children of the aristocracy. The Industrial Revolution gave children a chance to earn more money at actually easier work than they had had previously. Children could earn money in a textile mill. One of the main jobs which they'd perform be to tie ends together if they broke in a loom, which was easy for them to do. They didn't perform hard manual labor. That was for men. The workers were used according to their abilities, what kind of work they were best at, the division of labor. They understood that well before Adam Smith wrote about it. When the government came along and passed child labor laws, it took an option away from children. It said, you're not permitted. Textile mill owners may not employ you any longer. Well, you've just taken an option away from them. And as I said before, you hardly ever make people better off by taking away their options. So what did these children have to do? In many cases, they needed to work. In fact, virtually all cases, they needed to work to support the family and feed people as well as they had become accustomed to being fed, which was not terribly good, but it was still better than previously. So if we say you can't work any longer, what are they going to do? Most of them, when they were turned out of the factories, either found other factory work where it was less likely that they would be inspected, which probably meant lower paying work, more out-of-the-way work, maybe more dangerous work, or they turned to begging or stealing or prostitution. Taking their options away did not make them better off. What really ended child labor was when the benefits of higher wages and lower prices made their parents prosperous enough that it was no longer necessary to have children work. Only then did child labor really end.
But this is just totally the opposite of what we hear. I mean, Charles Dickens, you know, he is popularized in the educational media today, or the educational system, you know, as being the one that somehow brought people's attention to the fact that there were these terrible factories filled with children that were virtual slaves and working under appalling conditions.
He was a good novelist, but a poor historian and poor an economist.
It seems as though every time the government does something with very nice intentions, seeking to do good for the people, they actually end up harming the people.
That is very often the case. Economists like to call that the law of unintended consequences. When you step in with a coercive measure, saying we're going to, for instance, force you not to employ children, or we're going to require you to pay higher wages or mandate some other benefit, that interferes with the efficient, natural functioning of the marketplace, and there are always undesirable side effects.
Well, we have that right now with really politicians of both parties clamoring to raise the minimum wage. And what's that going to do to our economy?
What it will do, some people will benefit from it. Some people will keep their jobs at higher pay and they will feel fine. Some people will certainly lose their jobs, people whose productive capabilities were just barely at $4.25 an hour. They are not going to be hired any longer. Some of them will be discharged. They simply won't have jobs. Their jobs may be automated out. They may make do with a smaller number of more skilled people instead of a larger number of less skilled people. And I think most importantly of all, it'll make it much harder in the future for low-skilled people coming out of high schools, they may have been dropouts or immigrants or people with handicaps. It'll be much more difficult for them to persuade an employer to give them a chance to work. It's simply too costly.
Yeah, but you know, people like you with this kind of a viewpoint, you're characterized as being hard-hearted and you just don't care for the children and or don't care for the lower-paying workers. And how is anybody going to make it on $4.25 an hour? You know, that translates into what? Just over $10,000 a year or something. How are you ever going to raise a family on that? And it's the politicians that really have the compassion. You know, with the stroke of a pen, they can all of a sudden make everybody wealthier.
And if that were really true, we should have a minimum wage of $25 an hour. But I think everybody with an ounce of sense understands that the higher you raise the price of anything, the less of it's going to be purchased.